Hey everyone, and welcome to Risky Business. My name's Patrick Gray. We'll be chatting with Adam Boileau in just a moment about exploding pages, Ivanti-related drama, members of the COM being charged as domestic terrorists, and a bunch of other stuff. And then we'll be hearing from this week's sponsor, Push Security. To be transparent, I am an advisor with Push Security. They make an identity security product that plugs into your browsers to capture identity events as users initiate them. And this can be handy for all sorts of reasons. Luke Jennings from Push will join me this week to talk through some work he did tearing down an analysis-resistant phishing kit. These phishing kits, the ones that enable MFA bypass, they're getting really sophisticated to the point where email security products have a hard time actually loading up the URLs out of malicious messages and seeing the payload that's being delivered to users. So we talk about the analysis that Luke did, and then we chat a bit about why passkeys aren't a panacea for identity security. That is coming up later, but first up, it's time for a check of the week's security news with Adam Boileau. And mate, we're going to start off with this story out of Lebanon, where it looks like Israel has performed just an absolutely incredible supply chain infiltration, shipping thousands of exploding pages to Hezbollah, which they detonated today. Something like 3,000 pages went bang, injuring a lot of people. So far, 9 people have been killed, including, according to reports, a couple of kids, which is extremely sad. It's very sad. But look, let's walk through what's actually happened here. It really does look like straight up supply chain infiltration.
Yes, we saw when the story broke, basically first thing in the morning for me, there was a bit of speculation as to exactly what was going on. Like some early reports made it sound like perhaps the pages had been hacked and their onboard batteries triggered to explode. But pretty much as soon as you saw some of the footage, like it became clear that this was beyond a regular AAA battery in a pager. Like you're not going to get that much energy out of it. So it really does look like they interdicted a bunch of pages, fitted them with explosives, and then were able to trigger that remotely in a coordinated fashion. And I mean, that's like, there's so many moving parts in an operation like that beyond just, there's the interdicting some shipping and fitting these things with bombs, but then there's all of the work you have to do to get to the point where that shipment's going to happen, that they've decided to go with pages to start with. Because I mean, we've seen a lot of history in the conflict between Israel and its various neighbors where Israel has used its technological advantages for using surveillance of radio transmissions, hacking cell phones, monitoring communications lines and fixed fiber optic and fixed phone networks. It's a pretty hostile communications, like ComSec environment there. So there's just so many moving parts to this operation, and it's pretty stunning to read about.
Yeah, well, I mean, the thing to point out is the reason we're talking about this on a cybersecurity podcast that, also touches on SIGINT is the reason Hezbollah were using pages is it would make it impossible for the Israelis to track their movements. They'd made the switch to pages apparently after some of their commanders were killed over the last year following, the October 6 and related military action in southern Lebanon and Gaza. So it looks like their solution here was to go for pages, and somehow, according to reporting, the Israelis were managed to order something like 5,000 of these devices from the Taiwanese manufacturer and to place some sort of explosive device in them that was not discoverable to Hezbollah. So, I mean, it is a remarkable operation any way you slice or dice it. Excuse me. And to a degree, I mean, the targets are sort of self-selecting as well. So there was a way to do this in a way that would cause injury to enemy fighters while only killing a few of them. And as I mentioned at the top, it looks like, unfortunately, people unrelated to Hezbollah activity, a few of them may have been killed. But this is a lot less civilian damage than would be caused even by a single airstrike. So you have to look at this and say, this is the type of stuff we would like to see more of if the other option is things like airstrikes.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds horrible, but at the same time, I remember back when Israel was doing Stuxnet, there was, I think Mark Piper, my colleague Mark at the time, did a presentation where he showed a graph of like the death rate of Iranian nuclear scientists. And there was a real drop-off during Stuxnet because they had other ways to impact the nuclear program in Iran instead of motorcycle bombs, whilst they're in their commute or blowing up their holiday houses or whatever else. And once Stuxnet was snapped, then the death rate of Iranian nuclear scientists started to go back up again. And, so whilst the human costs of these things are tragic,
it's all relative, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's relative. It's like, unfortunately, that's the way it works with this sort of stuff, is civilian casualties can never be entirely eliminated. But in this case, they can, they were certainly minimized, you would have to say.
Yeah. I'm sure as a, proportion of, looking at, say, the other military actions going on in Gaza at the moment, like the proportion of, legitimate combatant targets as a ratio of, and this whole conversation just feels, it feels icky discussing human life like this, but it's the harsh reality, I guess, of the situation.
No one wants to have a conversation about the correct number of children who should die in a military action, right? Yes. So of course it feels icky. Yeah. But again, it is relative. There are still people who cannot live in southern Lebanon or northern Israel because of all of this. This is, there's rockets flying around. There's a lot going on. Yeah. So this isn't a bolt from the blue. It's an entirely legitimate action. I'm still curious. I'm obviously curious to know how they convinced them to buy their pages from their source. That's incredible. But I'm also curious how the device side of this works. As you pointed out, there's no way this was even a lithium-ion battery explosion. You look at the footage, there's no smoke and flame that's sort of typical of those sorts of explosions. I did see some speculation that perhaps they managed to squeeze some explosives into the batteries that were included in the device, and then they were able to, discharge enough current from the battery to make them, explode. We don't really know. I think, we will probably find out one day, but it's hard to say. But yeah, just all in all, a jaw-dropping operation. I woke up this morning listening to it on the radio. It's incredible.
Yeah, it really is a startling operation. And like if you're Hezbollah or Hamas or, any group that's in operation is in opposition to Israel, like, what are you going to do about this? Because, like, what communications mechanisms do you have left that you feel like you could use, you could trust, you could opt? Like, what a hostile environment to try and carry out, communications and operations and whatever else. And that, from that point of view, like, quite apart from the people who've been injured and are out of the fight, because of their injuries at the moment, like just the psychological impact of how do you function, how do you disseminate orders, how do you communicate? Yep. Like that's a real blow.
Yeah, Hamas are well known for using landline infrastructure as a counterintelligence measure. Hezbollah were moving in that direction as well. Again, Hezbollah figured out that their senior figures were being targeted because the Israelis were able to track their cell phones, right? So they ditched the cell phones, went to pages. That hasn't worked out. So I guess they're back to couriers and fixed line phones at this point. But you're right. Their command and control at this point is just a shambles.
Yeah, I think you linked me through to a Reuters piece that was talking about earlier efforts by Hezbollah, and they had, with Iran's help, deployed a fiber network around Lebanon for their communications. But then they had problems with Israelis breaking into that closed environment, and now they have to splinter it up into non-interconnected bits of network. And like it's I don't know what you would do, like if you were in charge of trying to provision that communication system. Like it's it's just a startling operation and stunning, unfortunately. Fortunately, depending on
depending on your point of view. I think most of us would agree that probably when it comes to Israel v Hezbollah, it's not tremendously difficult to pick a side. But again, the point really comes down to the fact that, look, I'll give you an example, right? Today, I was listening to an interview on BBC with a doctor in one of the hospitals in Lebanon, and the interviewer asked him, how many of these people who are coming in are civilians? And he kind of answered the question in a funny way, which is he said, it's difficult to tell because they're coming in civilian clothes. And I would say a better question would have been, how many of the people coming in were military-aged males? because that would give you a much more reliable indicator of whether or not they were Hezbollah versus the clothes that they were wearing at the time. So I think this is a incredibly scoped, well-targeted operation that certainly does have impacts on, certainly does touch cybersecurity and SIGINT to a degree, because the only reason this happened is because Hezbollah no longer trusted their phones.
Yeah, exactly. And Israel's expertise at penetrating technical systems, pushes them towards lower tech things. But as we've seen with, backdoored 2G, non-smartphones in the Russian market, things that we think about as being dumb, even quite apart from supply chain, may not be quite so dumb, right? We've learned a lot about InfoSec over the years, and a GSM, like 2G GSM baseband versus a modern SIGINT agency, like you haven't got a hope in hell with a non-smartphone either. So, yeah,
well, that's why Bin Laden relied on couriers, right? And that's what got him in the end.
Yeah.
Even someone turning up is enough if you can pin down the couriers. So yeah, just look, this one is going to be in the history books forever. Any sort of college doing war studies or intelligence studies, this is one of the big ones for the ages, for sure.
It certainly is.
Let's move on to some other news now. And, we said there was more to come last week when we spoke about this DOJ action against Russian disinformation. They'd indicated that there was, more to follow. And then we got this incredible info dump about Russia's media company, or, state-controlled media company, RT. The US authorities are alleging that RT is now fully integrated into Russian intelligence operations, and in fact that it had a cyber unit that was doing information operations. Now, we don't know exactly what this cyber unit did, whether it was, hacking information to be included in RT reports or was operating bot accounts, but we do know that they had some sort of cyber unit. Interestingly enough, too, the DOJ has doxed other outlets in various countries as being under the control of RT where that wasn't obvious. So yeah, what we said last week is right, which is this is a very big operation from the Americans to try to damage Russia's sort of misinformation and propaganda machine in the lead up to the election.
Yeah, it seems like a pretty comprehensive action, and we're already starting to see some downstream consequences of that. Meta, for example, have thrown RT's things off their various platforms, so no more Instagram posting for them. And then we've also seen some of RT's tendrils in other areas of the world, kind of outside the West. So like in Africa, for example, kind of a whole bunch more attention being paid to those. So it's this is the way that you expose disinformation, right? Is by shining light on it and letting people see it for what it is. And, it feels like a pretty effective, so far it feels like it's going to be a pretty effective operation for them against RT.
Yeah, you contrast this to, and this is something we mentioned last week as well, you contrast this to 2016 when the DOJ was caught flat-footed, 2020 yes. A little bit better, and now it just sort of feels like they're on top of this.
Yeah, exactly. And as well they should be. Like, we've had a number of years to get used to the various, tricks and techniques of this trade. And, we need good responses to this stuff to preserve democracy and other things.
Yeah. I sort of wonder when they talked about RT having a cyber unit, it kind of made me wonder about, the Murdoch tabloids when they were doing phone hacking.
Yes, yeah.
Does that count as a cyber unit? Like, what were they actually doing? And was it different to just like other shady media players, or just a thought that occurred to me?
Yeah, like, is it cyber or is it just search engine optimization?
Yeah, well, we don't know, but I'm sure eventually we'll find out. Staying with election stuff, the DOJ is also planning to file criminal charges against the people who hacked Donald Trump's presidential campaign. This was one that was attributed to Iran, so I'm guessing it's one of those, essentially doxing them. It's like, this guy who works for this unit in Iran, here's his picture, and he can't go to Disneyland anymore, which I'm guessing he wasn't planning to anyway. Yeah,
exactly. I think the Washington Post reported that there are charges pending, but there's no details of exactly who they've charged. But yes, I think you're right. It's just going to be the usual kind of no holidays in Florida for you, buddy.
Yeah, now looking to some state-sponsored hacking in this part of the world. There is a Pacific Islands Forum that operates around the Pacific. It's based in Fiji. Apparently, China had a go at them. And Australia, in response, has actually sent some incident responders. And this is part of a program that was spun up by Australia's Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, specifically to assist Pacific nations that are experiencing cyber incidents, whether that's ransomware or stuff like this. I don't think the Australian government hasn't actually confirmed that they responded to this, but the Kiwis wound up confirming that the Australians responded to this, which is a bit interesting. So it is out there, but Australia's being discreet about it. But you know, this is, we've spoken about this a few times over the last couple of years. This is terrific diplomacy for Australia in the region when you've got China trying to pull the Pacific Islands into its sort of sphere of influence. They were trying to sign all sorts of defense agreements and whatnot with them a couple of years ago. And I think it really just helps contrast China versus the West, right? When you've got China hacking into their forums and Australia sending the incident responders, you know, it kind of perhaps helps to show Australia in a better light than China, I'm going to say.
Yeah, like it sends the right vibes, as the kid would say.
Yeah, exactly,
like,
exactly.
Yeah. So good work, Australian diplomats and the Foreign Affairs team. But, China just has been... being such a bully in the Pacific. So I hope that contrast is very clear to everybody.
Yeah, me too. And I think it's excellent value for the Australian taxpayer as well. In terms of, if you could spend, I think the program's worth about 25 mil Aussie dollars. And if you can spend that amount of money and get that sort of diplomatic effect, that is going to save you a lot of money compared to China getting much more influence and like even a military presence in the region. Amazing value. So well done to the Australian government, I guess.
Yeah, and plus a bunch of incident responders get to hang by the pool at the Holiday Inn in Suva, which is the only place that you stay when you're doing cyber work in Fiji, because I have done the same thing. So I'm sure they enjoyed it.
Yeah, I believe too that they might be using external contractors for this, but that's probably not something I should know. But anyway, moving on. And Chinese, we've got a report here from Martin Matashak here at The Record, which is that Chinese-made cranes in the United States. So there's been this Republican-led study of the use of Chinese cranes in American ports, which I think is a very good thing to do, to look into their use. Funnily enough, though, one thing that they've found, one risk that they've identified, is that there are cellular modems that are attached to some of the computing bits and pieces that ship with these cranes that aren't kind of documented, right? And this report has found that they're an intelligence risk. Fair enough, but I would be cautious in suggesting that those things are there for sort of espionage or fishy purposes. It's just this sort of equipment comes with that sort of stuff, right?
Yeah, like one man's remote diagnostics is another man's, a backdoor at an intelligence access function. And, when we were having some of the conversations around, Huawei and ZTE and all of the other kind of Chinese supply chain concerns, like it's very hard to differentiate between, what's just normal engineering function, or in some cases, what's bad software engineering practice versus deliberate vulnerabilities. Like it's all super murky, and ultimately it's how you use it. And I can totally understand why the US is not keen on having their freight cranes controlled by potentially controllable by a third party, especially when the vendors, ZPMC, they're actually really big. Like I didn't realize quite how the US doesn't make cranes domestically anymore. Apparently they're going to start now with I think it was a Japanese firm that was now joint venturing.
Yeah.
But there's all sorts of interesting niches like that in the sort of globalized economy where you end up with these supply chain dependencies that no one ever stopped to think about until you don't have the heavy industry anymore.
Yeah, I mean, Tom Uren, our colleague, who is our, public policy and intelligence editor, he's written about the crane stuff pretty extensively. His view is that it's a little bit different to Huawei because the risks when it comes to cranes, you're more likely to be able to mitigate them than when someone's operating like the core of your telcos, right? Yeah. And I certainly do agree with him. And you can also see why a crane company would install cellular modems to do diagnostics, because otherwise you're talking about a whole integration project to get the people buying them to punch holes through their firewalls and like cable them up or get them on a particular RF network or whatever. It's just so much easier to throw an LTE modem into it so that if you need to do some remote diagnostics, you can. So, you know, I think probably what you would need to do in this case is just be aware of where these devices are located and have a plan to disable them should you need to. But I don't think this is a knockout blow against the concept of using Chinese-made cranes in Western ports, if I'm honest. And as you point out, this crane manufacturer, I think they are the #1 in the world. Like, they're huge.
Yeah. Like, I don't know where else you're gonna buy your cranes, and yeah, like layering controls around these things. I mean, you know, you've got options here that you know, as you very rightly point out, you have options here that when your entire cell network is Huawei, like there's no way to not have a Huawei cell net if you have a Huawei cell net. But
yes,
you can probably turn off some modems or take the SIM cards out, or you know, have it connect to an APN that you control, and then can mitigate access or can control access when support's necessary, etc. Like, there are options that, you know, are achievable in ways that just not having a Huawei cell net isn't.
Yeah, 100% agreed. We got a finding here out of a CISA audit, which I think is interesting because I've seen a number of people making the same claim, and it's one that I happen to agree with, which is that stolen creds are still the #1 risk out there to enterprise computing environments, right? Which is, you know, we're on this show, we love talking about sophisticated O-Day, we love talking about the latest, you know, the latest TTPs, but fundamentally the way people are getting rinsed, and this is something that, you know, sponsor guests like Ryan Calumber from Proofpoint just love hammering away at, which is it's still just stolen creds and cred stuffing. And, you know, that's the stuff that's resulting in most of the harm. So it's good to see CISA put out some work on this and sort of back up the claim.
Yeah, they in their assessments, they found, I think, 41% of initial access intrusions were through, you know, kind of valid accounts that already existed that someone had obtained credentials to. Now, obviously, you've got options for layering multi-factor, et cetera, but, you know, the proof is very much in the pudding here that that's how people are getting in. And that's a problem that, you know, you probably need to solve more than exotic zero-day, much as it pains me to say.
Yeah, it's not as interesting to talk about, but it is the real problem, right? And staying on that topic, we actually have a statement here from Fortinet about an incident that they experienced. I believe this is the one that I was talking about a couple of weeks ago where I didn't name the vendor, where someone actually managed to get into the SharePoint, access SharePoint via the account of someone who no longer worked there. So I think what they'd done is they'd pushed, like, everyone needs MFA, but that person had gone and that account hadn't been offboarded. Someone managed to access that account, steal a bunch of firewall configs, and off they went. You know, Fortinet is downplaying it. They're saying it was a small number, less than 0.3% of Fortinet customers. That's still quite a few customers in my view. But the thing that really annoyed me about this statement is they say an individual gained unauthorized access to a limited number of files stored on Fortinet's instance of a third-party cloud-based shared file drive. Now, if it's your SharePoint, you're really going to call that third party?
Yeah, that's kind of stretching it a little bit there. I mean, I see what they're doing, like they're trying to walk that very fine weaselly line, but we see you, Fortinet. We see you.
We see you with your weasel words about third party, like, oh yeah, our third party, you know, access to, someone accessed our third party of our M365. It's like, come on, that's not how this works anymore.
No, it is not.
It just ain't. And also on the topic of stolen creds, WordPress is now going to require two-factor authentication for plugin developers. This one's from Christian Vasquez over at Cyberscoop. Good move, well overdue.
Yeah, makes sense. Like, there's a few technical nitty-gritty bits they have to worry about, like how they're going to bolt it into their code repositories and stuff, which I think they've done through an extra set of credentials. But yeah, regardless of the technical specifics, good choice. There's still so much WordPress out there, and there's, you know, been so many attacks on the WordPress supply chain. So good plan.
Now let's talk about the drama involving Ivanti and its use in the US federal government. John Grieg's written this one up for the record. You know, CISA is now ordering agencies to remove end-of-life Ivanti appliances or upgrade them to new versions. But it looks like those upgrades would be paid upgrades. Is that right?
I'm not sure if they're paid, but they certainly are very recent, because there was some bugs in, I think, The product is their cloud service appliance, and there was some 0 days that were out there being exploited, and Ivanti said, well, yeah, this version's out of date, go update your stuff. It's your fault for running old out of date things. And then I went and looked at the actual end of life matrix for their products. It's end of life 2 weeks ago.
Yeah, wow.
And they'll still sell it to you. Product availability, December 2024. Critical security fixes stop August 2024. So yeah, I don't know that Ivanti gets to,
Well, that's where I got my wires crossed on the paid part. So you can just buy the vulnerable end of life version.
You can still buy the vulnerable end of life one, but yeah, they'll sell it to you, but they just won't patch it. So yeah, really. So bad vendor behavior count increments, by another for this episode.
Yeah, that's it. No biscuit for Ivanti.
No biscuit.
For sure. It's been a while since we've given out a no biscuit, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. And I think Ivanti definitely deserves to not have a biscuit.
Yeah, and we've linked through to that matrix that you mentioned. Now it's time to talk about the most disturbing story of the week. And I got to say that I actually did feel physically ill reading this, and I'm not exaggerating. I felt ill reading this. It is a absolutely top-notch wrap up from Brian Krebs over at Krebs on Security, and I would recommend everybody read this if you're going to read one thing this week, because it's a breakdown on the COM and the associated actors and entities around this. These are hyper-violent young cyber criminals who are doing just awful stuff around sextortion and whatnot. A bulk of the story is just really writing up a lot of the activity that occurs in this sort of crime ecosystem. Very well researched, as you'd expect, and just very well written. But the thing that I wanted to talk about this week is that the DOJ has done something interesting here, which is they're starting to use terrorism statutes to go after these actors. And there's an interesting bit of analysis in this article which says that it gives investigators more options when they're putting together a brief, when they want to charge these sort of people, but it might backfire on them when they get to court, because the judges, might just say, look, this is not what these statutes are for. And the burden of proof to convicting someone for terrorism offences is very high. Now, initially when you and I spoke about this, before I'd read the piece in its entirety, I thought, gee, that's not what those statutes are for. This is really horrible. Why would the DOJ do such a thing? But then you read the entire story, you read what these people are actually doing, and you think, geez, maybe there is some legitimacy to using terrorism statutes to charge these guys.
That was the journey I went on as well, because there's just a whole bunch of really, just horrible details about, the kinds of things that they were doing. And, it's not just financial crime, right? I mean, some of these are, deeply personal, exploitative sextortion and all sorts of nasty stuff, along with, violence and thuggery and things. So I can, initially, yes, it felt a little bit strange because we've seen so much overreach in computer crime prosecutions over the years where, kind of laws have been used very bluntly. And so there's a natural kind of, worry when you start seeing other laws being pulled in. But I think in this case, honestly, it's probably a pretty reasonable choice. And assuming that they can pull together the necessary burden of proof to, to press these charges, some of the powers that they get when investigating terrorism may be useful for dealing with people who are trying to avoid, using good OPSEC practice and all sorts of things that are more terrorist-like in terms of how they operate versus just kind of regular criminals. So, yeah, I mean, we will see how it works out for the DOJ. But I mean, the Krebs piece, you're totally right. It's worth reading for everybody just to kind of get a handle about quite how gross some of the stuff is.
Yeah, Brian quotes actually from a piece from Wired's Ali Winston. So the quote is, victims have flushed their heads in toilets, attacked their siblings, killed their pets, and in some extreme instances attempted or died by suicide. So this is, this is the level of depravity that we're talking about. I mean, there's sexual coercion and manipulation here. There's violence. You know, and I think the DOJ is arguing that there is a racially motivated violent extremist ideology at play here as well, which is probably why they can invoke the statutes, because a lot of these people are Nazis. So, you know, have at it, I say, overreach away.
Dear, yeah, I mean...
But ultimately, it's the courts who are going to decide, right? Like
yes,
the DOJ,
right.
and this is every time I've talked to people like experienced lawyers and legal scholars about things like material support for terrorism charges, which always felt a little weird to me. Like, you know, you could be someone who analyzes ISIS, for example. You could translate one of their statements, put it on your, you know, Pat's terrorism studies blog, and that's perfectly legal. You translate the same message and plant it on your, you know, Pat's terrorism is great blog, and it's a crime, which always felt a little bit funny to me. But, you know, these people always put me in my place, which is they're like, well, you know, there's a question of intent there and whether or not you're trying to further the activities of a terrorist group. And ultimately the judges decide, and they have bounced charges previously in exactly instances like that, where people have just, you know, translated something or whatever. The judges just say, look, you just haven't met the bar here. So it'll be interesting to see how it plays out in the courts. But again, you know, if you want to just feel sick, go read that story.
Yeah, absolutely. And the next example we have is actually some convictions, some sentencing as a result of people doing, in this case, like SIM swapping. And this was the group we talked about a while ago that was like home invading people to steal crypto. After they'd kind of leveled up from just regular SIM swapping, they decided they were going to go do physical violence instead. So they'd home invade people and force them to hand over their cryptocurrency, use the blockchain to figure out who had cryptocurrency, et cetera, et cetera. This crew, one of them got a 47-year jail sentence.
Yep.
And some of his co-conspirators are like 20 years in jail. And once again, these are horrific crimes that have kind of transcended out of cyber and grew out of communities like the COM that start doing cybercrime and then turn into real, you know, physical violence and other crimes as well. So, you know, these guys I don't think were being done under, you know, terrorism style laws, but 47 years in jail, like that's
well, that'd be the home invasions that got on that, you know, yes, less than the, you know, violent home invasions will tend to get you sent to prison. But even then, I mean, you get less for killing people, right? So
yeah.
I think that the courts are certainly trying to send a message there. Now let's move on to a bit of a discussion about the mop-up after the, you know, the CrowdStrike event back. When was that? Was that July? I think it was July. When the
so recent, but yet so long ago.
Exactly. So we got a piece here from Semaphore, and I've got mixed feelings about it, if I'm honest. The headline is CrowdStrike ex-employees, quality controller was not part of our process. And what they've done is they've talked to a bunch of ex-CrowdStrike employees who have, you know, they've complained about the company, basically, right? And they've said things like their cloud security product was nowhere near ready for prime time and they pushed it out anyway. And they had a whole bunch of people, you know, actually manually doing work in the background until the detections were up and working properly. And they just sort of paint a picture of a company where QA is not really a massive priority. But that said, it doesn't really seem like they spoke to people who are directly involved in the core product. And it also just seems like a lot of what they describe is business as usual at a software company, especially a growing one, right? And I don't know whether or not this is the knockout blow that the people who wrote the piece think it is.
Yeah, that was exactly my takeaway from this as well. Like a lot of this sounds like, have you ever been to a, you know, like a modern tech firm, like seat of the pantsing it and, you know, mechanical turking behind your cloud product and, you know, skipping a bunch of QA because speed to market is more important. Like, that's just what we do. Like, it's not good. We're not proud of it, but like, that's, you know, there's a reason we have so many bugs in our products, right? And the security industry in particular, a whole bunch of complexity, a whole bunch of corners that get cut to compete and get to market. So, I mean, I'm sure that the employees that talk to the people writing this article absolutely have, you know, strongly held beliefs about how it could have been done better. But, you know, we all know areas where our employers or whoever could improve things, given more resource, given more time, given a slower pace. Like, everyone's got ideas like that. So, yeah, like, not everybody has the luxury of doing it properly like we do here at Risky Business Media.
Nice save there, guy. Well done. Yeah, and I mean, you got to realize too that the core product, it's actually pretty well engineered, right? And they did do a lot of work to make sure. I mean, the fact that it wasn't like blue screening devices constantly for the last 10 years is amazing, right? Considering the amount of stuff it's doing in the kernel.
Yeah.
So I think, and obviously their QA was insufficient. Otherwise what happened wouldn't have happened. But I think this might be a bit of a reach because you've got your core CrowdStrike agent and then, CrowdStrike as a company, it's going through what I call the semanticification process where they try to just acquire all sorts of features and new stuff and plug it into their platform. And a lot of it's not very good. I don't mind saying that. I think their core product is amazing, but I hear terrible feedback based on some of their other stuff. So, no surprises that around the periphery, things look pretty ghastly. But, we've linked through to it in this week's show notes so people can take a look for themselves. We've got another related story here from Security Week. Ryan Narain wrote this one up, and it's looking at how, Microsoft has had a series of meetings with the EDR vendors, and it looks like they're really doing the right thing when it comes to trying to rescope the type of access that EDR companies will require their own sort of kernel solutions for. So it looks like Microsoft is trying to listen to them and say, well, what are some of the things that we can put in an API for you so that you can just start getting some of this risky stuff out of the kernel? And I think, this is the best possible response that we could have hoped for out of Microsoft. We talked previously about how we'd heard that this is what they were planning to do. And it looks like, they're turning the handle on this now, and that's great.
Yeah, no, this is great news. There isn't any specifics about kind of like what it's going to look like, but I think, we can imagine, we've seen like eBPF, for example, in the Linux world and some of the Mac systems for hooking the kernel for various security functions. Like, it makes sense that Microsoft would engineer something sensible. And, for all of Microsoft's flaws, they have a lot of really smart engineers who will come up with, I'm sure, a good solution, especially given the scrutiny that this is going to get.
But what was their crazy Windows recorder thing a few months back that they wound up killing off?
The recall, yeah. Well,
recall, right? So these are the people who bring us recall, right? Which was just daft and and terribly implemented. And now they're doing this in a really sensible way. It's like it just seems like it's kind of arbitrary, right?
Yes, so there's pockets of competence.
Yeah, don't take it for granted, I guess, Adam, is what I'm saying, right? Because they are just stochastic competence. I don't know. It's just bizarre. Apple is trying to dismiss its lawsuit against NSO Group because it looked like they were about to have to cough up all sorts of information that they didn't want to in court. They've, taken their bat and ball and gone home, but they've said, look, we did a lot of damage to NSO. The industry has kind of moved on from there anyway, so it wouldn't really help anyone to continue this lawsuit. Suzanne Smalley had the write-up for the record, and I don't know that there's too much to add here.
No, that's pretty much it. It's been a while since they filed that lawsuit and the world has kind of changed around them. Yeah, indeed. And we've also got some new sanctions. John Greig's written this one up again for the record. The Treasury Department on Monday sanctioned 5 people and 1 entity tied to the Intellexa consortium, a notorious holding company responsible for the Predator spyware. So yeah, I think what happened is there were some sanctions that went down on Intellexa, and then they sprung up new business units or companies or entities or whatever to continue to sell it. And now it's just like, I think Treasury is just going to play the sanctions whack-a-mole game for a while. Yeah, that seems to be pretty much it. I mean, we've seen there was some, I think it was the Citrox arm in Cyprus and a few other bits and pieces that, were kicking around and still doing business. So yes, bang goes the whack-a-mole hammer.
Now let's talk about a news item out of Medellin in Colombia, where this fella, Yariv Bokor, who worked for Sandvine, which is a surveillance tech company. I mean, they do other stuff as well. They're like a network tech company that also offers a lot of surveillance capability around the place. He was found dead, apparently in Medellin. I saw a couple of tweets saying that perhaps his watch was stolen, but this has blown up in the Colombian media because the president is, investigating the prior administration's use of NSO Group spyware, and Sandvine at one point, Francisco Partners, the private equity based in the United States, held shares in Sandvine. I don't know what the precise ownership is, if they still own it or whatever, but they also had an interest in NSO. So the local media there is kind of like trying to paint this as some sort of assassination of someone due to a connection to NSO that, in my view, is tenuous at best.
Yeah, I mean, I imagine that walking around town with a Rolex in Medellin maybe not the best move in the world. I know you're into watches. Maybe you notice what sort of watch he was missing.
That's not the best move in the world.
yeah. So like, there's plenty of other plausible explanations here, but also, you know, like we've seen these spyware scandals really get pretty big and involved in other parts of the world. So who really knows? Could be. Might not be.
I think walking around any city flaunting an expensive watch is a terrible idea, to be honest. Doesn't matter whether you're in Sydney or Medellin, but I think it's riskier in Medellin for sure.
Probably, yes.
And now this isn't technically a cyber story, but I do think it's an interesting one. I think it's actually a good idea, which is Meta is spinning up a Instagram account type just for teenagers that has a lot more protections built into it. And I think this is a superb idea.
Yeah, this does seem to be a real smart move. These teen accounts, I think, by default are not public. So your friends will see your content, but not the rest of the world. And then changing a bunch of the kind of core privacy and kind of settings for your account requires parental approval. And then there's also like a sleep mode where at nighttime it will just like turn off your DMs and other things and stop alerting you and auto reply to your messages. And as someone with a 16-year-old daughter myself, I can understand why that is quite a good idea. So yeah, I think they're going to turn these on for anyone under 18 that have Meta accounts. So yeah, it's weird seeing Facebook doing a good thing.
Yeah, I mean, my kids are 6 and 3, and it's just my hope that by the time they get to sort of social media age, where they're hassling me to spin up accounts and have devices and stuff, that this is largely a solved problem.
Yeah, I hope so.
Yeah, we can hope, can't we? We got one here from Cyberscoop, which relates to the Record, because Recorded Future, which operates the Record, which, as people would know, is a news service that we all admire tremendously here at Risky Biz HQ. Indeed, our news editor, Catalin Kimpanu, he used to work there. MasterCard has bought Recorded Future for $2.65 billion. And it makes me wonder what the future is going to look like for the Record. I'm not saying this in any sort of sense of, gee, it'll be great if the Record goes away. Like, we absolutely do not want that to happen. It's one of the last mastheads where really good InfoSec journalism gets done. And I saw this news and I just thought, oh God, I hope they hang on to it. And I just, I think in the short term, it's going to be safe, but I worry about the long-term future of the Record now that the company that operates it is owned by MasterCard.
Unfortunately, I am with you, and it would be a pity to see them go, because we've seen a few other outlets, kind of wind down over the years. The places that we would often have content for the show from, and it's always concerning when you see people whose mastheads you read all the time getting wrapped up in a thing like this, because it's very easy for it to be, it says right now we will remain an independent and open intelligence platform for Recorded Future as a whole, but a line item for, oh, and by the way, we own a media company. Like, doesn't take very many years for that to go. But why exactly do we do that? Can we just like delete that line item and
I mean, we saw Symantec do that to Security Focus a million years ago. We saw Kaspersky shut down Threatpost. It's just these things, they come and go. But I think what's changed is that, these days we track InfoSec news. It's a big part of what we do. We really closely monitor the news. And these days we tend to track individual journalists more than we track individual mastheads, which is something that kind of changed over the years, because you'll have some people who write about security at Wired or at ours, Dan Gooden, and you've got Andy Greenberg at Wired and whatnot. But in terms of pure play cybersecurity news outlets, there's not many left that are really doing good work. You've got Cyberscoop, which largely covers a lot of government stuff and big picture stuff. You've got Cybersecurity Dive, which does a little bit of industry news sort of thing. But the Record is one of my favorites because they have a decent breadth of coverage. I think they had a period where they focused a little bit too much on writing stories about individual ransomware attacks that may or may not have been successful, but they've got some incredible talent over there and they do great work. And as I say, thinking of all of you out there, and I hope you're not nervous about this. I hope I haven't made you nervous about this by mentioning it. But yeah, that was just something I thought of. And before we sign off, Adam, I just wanted to mention too that I heard that the Politico story we spoke about last week involving an Iranian organization in the financial sector being ransomware and the government sort of insisting that they pay. I've heard there's some question marks on that story around two points that Politico wrote, which was that the government encouraged payment of the ransom. I've heard that that's like in dispute, and also the amount that they were ransomed for was more likely to be closer to $500,000 than $3 million. So just wanted to put that out there, that one, some details there might have been, some details there are disputed. Let's just put it that way.
Yeah, it can certainly get a little bit murky, in a place like Iran where, we don't necessarily speak the native language and we do have to rely a bit on other people's reporting. Yeah.
Anyway, that is it for this week's news segment, mate. Thank you so much for joining us. And it's just, isn't it crazy that last week, it was such a slow week, and this week so much going on. It's just how it goes. But yeah, great to chat to you, and we'll do it all again next week.
Yeah, thanks very much, Pat. We certainly will. I'll see you then.
That was Adam Boileau there with a check of the week's security news. It is time for this week's sponsor interview now with Luke Jennings from Push Security. Push Security makes an identity security product that plugs into your browsers and can do all sorts of things like tell you which SaaS apps your staff are using, whether they're using MFA and so on. And you can also do things like prevent your staff from entering their SSO passwords into anything that isn't your SSO. They can also enforce MFA across SaaS apps that your staff are using, but a big feature for Push out of the box is just plain old phish kit detection and blocking. So why would you need this in your browser? Simply put, because these phish kits are doing a lot of work these days to evade detection, in addition to doing things like MFA evasion by doing one-time passcode pass-through. But on evasion, these days, if a mail gateway pulls a link out of a message and then tries to render it, a lot of the time the kit can just detect that and not render. Push will see it in the browser though, so that's why they're in the browser. Luke Jennings is with Push Security and did a teardown on one of these kits. They're using Cloudflare features extensively to avoid rendering for non-human users. Here's Luke talking about all of that.
I look into attack on the middle phish kits sometimes, and this one was just an interesting example. It was an example of naked pages, which is one family. And it just sort of occurred to me just how many steps are in place now to try to frustrate detection and investigation. So, it kind of pretty much, you have to go through this whole series of steps as in a user's browser to get to the phish. So it's hosted by Cloudflare workers, so it's a legitimate domain. That's already getting on one control. Then you've got Cloudflare turnstile in place. So that's them doing the bot detection, and that's making it difficult for automated scrapers to actually get through to it. And it's just a series of steps that goes on from there, like that you then need to send the right URL parameters, the right JavaScript needs to execute, and to go to the next stage. If it fails at any point, it will redirect off to a legitimate domain and then just sort of end. It'll mask referrers along the way. It will load balance new domains. There's a whole series of steps that you have to go through, and only once you've met all of them will it finally try to phish you. So it's like, it's the sandbox evasion techniques that we've seen in the past to deal with sort of malware detonation. It's just the identity world equivalent for that we're seeing with phish kits now.
Yeah, I mean, I was, when you first suggested to me that we talk about, the state of the art with, MFA, bypass phishing, whatever you want to call it, attacker in the middle kits. I thought, ho-hum. And then you sent me a write-up and I started reading it and I'm like, oh, okay, right. Like they're really doing stuff now to beat this sort of evasion. I mean, I imagine the purpose of most of the obfuscation here is to defeat things like your email security gateways, right?
Yeah, I think a lot of it is. It makes it very difficult for you to catch something early and just identify that it's malicious. It's very difficult to know that it's malicious until the user's been through those steps. So yeah, for something like a gateway solution, that's difficult. And it just buys them enough time to get value out of it until they then move on to the next iteration. So it changes the economics of the situation, and it makes it very difficult for a gateway solution like that to work.
Now, I'd imagine too that, like, okay, so, you're in the browser, so you're seeing what the user sees, which puts you at a real advantage straight out the gate. But I'm wondering, are you expecting you're going to start to see at least some obfuscation attempts that are designed to defeat browser plugins as well, like the way you operate? I mean, I'd imagine it's always going to be harder, isn't it, to try to obfuscate something that the plugin can see just as the user can see.
Yeah, I mean, I think obviously security is always a cat and mouse game. We will see that eventually. I haven't really seen much focused on that yet, but it's much harder to do that against the browser, I think, because if you consider the equivalent with, say, what a proxy sees, back in the day, it was HTML going back and forth and there's inspection going on. Now you're pretty much dealing with a downloadable JavaScript application where most of the things going on are actually within the browser, and the proxy isn't seeing that. Whereas in the browser, we can instrument at different steps. We can sort of see every event as things unpack, as things are deobfuscated. We can, look at user click events and typing events. So, of course, I'm sure there will be a battleground there, but, inherently the browser is very powerful for observing what actual user behavior occurs. And that gives us a lot of flexibility.
Yeah, I mean, worst comes to worst, you can screen cap it and OCR it, right? Like, I mean, there's, if as long as you are there seeing what the user sees, like you're operating already at such an advantage. Now, I want to talk a little bit about, like, solutions to enterprises being phished, right? Because this is one way to really make it very hard for adversaries to phish users in your organization, because you've got the phish kit detection as part of the plugin. You've also got things like SSO password protection. We've talked about that on previous episodes, but essentially that will prevent a user from entering their SSO password into anything that isn't their SSO, because you'll just sort of straight up, you'll just shut that down in the browser. But, there might be people listening to this or watching this who are thinking, well, surely the solution here is, for an Entra shop, for example, to use passkeys with Microsoft Authenticator, right? Why is that not the preferred solution here? Because, I know you're doing well. I know you're closing big deals, right? Like, what is stopping those people from relying on something like Authenticator passkeys and they're going for this sort of solution instead?
Yeah, I mean, I think obviously the issue is, like, passkeys are new, and there's a cost associated with deploying them all, and then you have to consider what happens when people lose devices or lose passwords. So there's obviously a cost associated with that as well. And then in terms of support, yes, we see the major platforms having added support for them. But if you're talking about the broader space of all the different downstream SaaS applications you might use that might not even support SSO, for example, let alone passkeys, you've got that broader problem to deal with too. So, one of the things we thought about was that, hey, look, the passwords have been used for a long time. They're not going away completely. But what we can do by pinning them to applications they're used for is effectively almost turn a password into a passkey as best we can and derive some of those benefits. The reason passkeys are not phishable is because they're locked to the website they operate for, and that's what we're enforcing in the browser with our solution too. So it just makes it a very easy, quick way to make a big jump up straight away.
Well, not to mention too, I mean, the other thing that I thought you were going to mention, because we talked about it the other day, is that we have seen like MFA downgrade attacks targeting users as well, right? Like a passkey is only effective when it's the only authentication flow available to a user. But but because of those issues that you described earlier, when it comes to like provisioning and, passkey gets destroyed, phone gets lost or whatever, usually there are workaround procedures and attackers treat that as an opportunity to run downgrades, right?
Yeah, I mean, that's another thing. I think that's to be similar to what we saw with SSL downgrade attacks in the past. People use passkeys, but they're not enforced on the server side. There's always like that option to click to verify something else. There are phish kits that already take advantage of this, that just force the authentication to go through a phishable means. It depends on the kit as to whether it's supported, but yeah, that's going to be an ongoing issue. If that is one of the things people do to deal with the downsides of someone losing a passkey or being in a situation where they can't use it, is supporting other MFA methods as fallback when they need to. But then, of course, that immediately opens up that avenue for attack for to actually downgrade and force those things. So yeah, unless you absolutely require that and make sure that nothing else is accepted, then you've got that threat there.
Well, another thing you point out, right, is you might be able to do that for your SSO, right? Even if you're going to make this big bold step towards passkeys, which I think people should, but you can do that for your SSO, but that's not going to help you when it comes to all of those extra SaaS apps, right? That companies might not even have a good understanding of like how they're being used. So, Snowflake being a perfect example. I mean, one of the things that you're doing with your product is you're actually doing like MFA survey to find out how many non-MFA accounts are in an org and where they are, but you can also do MFA enforcement, right? And can you even get as granular with your enforcement as forcing people to select the most robust, like phishing resistant authentication methods, or is that a little bit beyond what you can do at this stage?
That's not something we're enforcing in the product at the moment. We'll provide the visibility of those MFA methods, and then we'll put the controls in place on the password issuance. But it's something definitely, obviously, as we move into the future, we're going to be wanting to look into more controls for locking it down.
Yeah. So let's go back to this this analysis that you did of that kit. I'd imagine you were seeing, I'd imagine you've got some pretty good telemetry now with the product. What are the top kits out there, and where are you seeing them most? I mean, what are the orgs that you're seeing being targeted with the good stuff?
I think we've just generally seen a much bigger increase in probably in the last few months, especially. And we've even seen examples of ones that are clearly only targeting businesses. That particular example that I read about in that blog post would, if you entered a personal Microsoft account, it would actually just redirect off to something legit and not continue. So that one was clearly sort of B2B targeting specifically.
Not even interested in somebody's Hotmail, right?
Yeah, exactly. It would just redirect to the legitimate live.com website, which I thought was actually quite surprising in that one. But yeah, that one was clearly business focused. And yeah, we first saw it because it hit a customer of ours. But yeah, we've just in terms of stories, like people we know in the industry, we've had calls from people that really hadn't paid attention to attacker in the middle phishing until fairly recently, and then have messaged us, a month later saying, "Oh, we've just been hit 3 times in the last month, and we weren't prepared for that." So I think. In general,
is this sorry to cut you off, but is this due to sort of uptick in activity, or is it because some of this evasion stuff is really starting to get around the ESGs and whatnot?
I think it's a mixture of both, and now it's being successful. It's like obviously attackers lock in on something that works. Once they realize they've got a new technique that's working, they're going to focus more on it. So I think that's where we've seen a lot of these increases coming from.
So let me ask you this, besides the obvious answer, which is to go out and buy as many push licenses as you possibly can, what is it that you think anyone listening to this should be doing to try to minimize their risk to, some of these campaigns, which, as you point out, are really targeting business right now? And look, as we know, from stuff we've seen over the last year, people are turning phished creds into code execution in all sorts of weird and wonderful ways, and it can really go from phishing to ransomware, right? Which is nuts, depending on configuration and whatnot. But what are you recommending people actually do at the moment about this when some of those traditional controls like the ESG-based scanning are not working as well?
Sure. I would say if I'm talking sort of independent from our products, the first thing to do is testing. People normally have their red teams, they have their pen testers. In this space, Evil Jinx is an open source attack in the middle kit, which is becoming more and more popular. My view is Evil Jinx is CrowdStrike now. It's of this era. It is the new CrowdStrike. If you're not doing it already, you should have your internal red teams or external red teams conducting these attacks against you as an organization to see how well they work. And how if you're able to detect and respond to them, that's always a good first step.
But how would you detect something like that though? You know what I mean? Because our current, this is what drives me insane. Is EDR is not really set up to detect malicious stuff being presented to the user through the browser. Even though if you're in the browser, you can tell it's this kit, right? You can tell. They can't. So how on earth are you going to have a detection stack that can pick this up? I mean, I know I'm just sort of basically reciting the whole, founding principle of your company here, but like,
Yeah.
is there another way? Is there like what else in your detection stack is actually going to find that?
Yeah, look, it's tough. I mean, I think in general, I always like to think of things in terms of the pyramid of pain and trying to apply it to this space. So like, yeah, if you're reliant on threat intelligence and bad domains and IPs and that kind of thing, you're going to be backwards looking. You're going to pick some things up, but most of the new stuff's going to get through. If you can look into the sort of tool detection side, that's a bit better. We do that in our space, but where we've really tried to focus is on the behavior. The behavior that can't be changed, like a user entering a password into the wrong website, that being phishing. That's why we're in the browser, because we can see that more easily. But yeah, I mean, it's tough to give sort of independent, easily replicatable advice there, because we've gone into the browser to do that for that reason.
Yeah,
so
because I mean, your advice there was a little bit like, yeah, you should detect it. That's like, well, how? With magic, like, what are you going to say with your magic detection stack?
It's tough. I think that the principles I said there about the pyramid of pain apply, but yeah, realistically, there aren't that many great options for dealing with this right now. It's an evolving area. We've gone into the browser because we think it's the best place to observe them. But yeah, it's tough to do with an existing stack, I think.
Yeah. Are you sort of surprised that the EDR vendors aren't there as well? I mean, even just with something cut down, like forget about something as powerful as push, but just even something with basic phish kit detection. Like, it boggles my mind that we've got these companies out there worth tens of billions of dollars, and they're just like, lol, not our problem.
Yeah, I guess often with large companies they get so focused on their one product, and it's harder to like separate out.
If it's not code execution, it's not on us, right? Like, that seems to be a bit the thinking. Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, you're right. So many things have moved into this space that it's surprising we don't see more already happening in the browser with some of these vendors, because we've got a big shift in attacks in this direction, and EDR just doesn't have the right level of visibility for this, so it can't really solve the problem on its own. But yeah, I mean, I think if I'm making famous last word predictions, I'm sure in general we're going to see a lot more happening in the browser from different vendors across the space, in the near future. It seems to me just to be the obvious way things are going to go.
Yeah, I mean, I 100% agree with you. 100%. Like, it is amazing to me that we haven't seen more in there, and I think it's on. But we're going to wrap it up there. Luke Jennings, thank you so much for joining me for that conversation. Very interesting stuff. I'll link through to the blog post of your teardown of that adversary in the middle kit. Very good stuff. Great to chat to you. I'll catch you next time.
Thank you for having me.
That was Luke Jennings there from Push Security, and you can find them at pushsecurity.com. And that is it for this week's show. I do hope you enjoyed it. I'll be back next week with more security news and analysis. But until then, I've been Patrick Gray. Thanks for listening.